The sky hung heavy over Oak Ridge, that kind of soft, overcast gray that made everything feel cleaner than it really was. The homes all looked like they were pulled from a catalog. Two-story colonials with manicured lawns, circular driveways, and live, laugh, love signs discreetly tucked beside mailboxes. Beneath the charm, though, the air carried a kind of stillness, a guarded silence, one that didn't need words to draw lines. Julian Blake had seen neighborhoods like this before, on postcards, on television, on billboards for mortgage companies, that rarely returned his grandfather's calls back in the day. But today, he wasn't here to admire the architecture or make polite conversation. He had keys in his hand. He had a deed in his glove box. He had a plan. His SUV pulled slowly into the driveway of 1236 Pinecliff Lane. The house stood slightly older than its neighbors, its white paint chipped in places, the shutters faded to a tired blue. It had been foreclosed 6 months ago, left empty since. But Julian didn't see the neglect. He saw potential. He parked, stepped out, and took a deep breath. The air was crisp with late autumn. Dry leaves skittered across the driveway. He adjusted the collar of his charcoal peacoat and walked toward the front porch, the key warm from his palm. The sound of a door creaking open caught his ear. From across the street, a woman in a beige sweater stood stiff on her stoop, holding a mug and squinting like she couldn't quite place him. Then came the second pair of eyes. An older man trimming hedges 2 houses down, who paused, leaned on his shears, and watched. Wordless. Still. Julian kept walking. The porch creaked. The key slid into the lock. It turned. He stepped inside. It smelled like dust and dry wood. The air was stale but full of promise. Julian moved through the room slowly, noting every fixable corner, every place where light could pour in once the curtains were gone. Hardwood, floors, solid bones, a kitchen that could shine with just the right tile. As he took photos on his phone, his screen lit up with a text from his contractor. "Running late. Be there in 20. Julian replied, "No problem," and continued to survey the space. He didn't notice the flashing lights until the red and blue bled through the frosted windows. Outside, a cruiser had pulled into the driveway. 2 officers stepped out. One adjusted his belt, the other spoke into his shoulder mic. Julian froze. He exhaled. This wasn't new. He walked calmly to the door, opened it with both hands visible. The older officer called out, "Sir, can we help? You?" Julian raised an eyebrow. "I live here." The second officer, younger, frowned. "We got a call about a break-in. Neighbors said someone was in the home." Julian nodded slowly. "I'm the owner. Bought it last week. I have the paperwork. In my truck." There was a pause, short but loud. "You mind stepping out and showing us your ID?" He did. He walked to his SUV, pulled out the deed and his license, handed them over without a tremble. The older officer read the papers, eyes narrowing. "You, a developer?" Julian replied, "Yes." The younger officer cleared his throat. "You understand the neighbors were just being cautious. It's not every day someone sees a new face around here." Julian smiled tightly. "I'm sure." Across the street, the woman with the mug had now pulled out her phone and was recording, eyes wide like she was watching a movie she didn't understand. Julian looked back at the officers. "Am I free to get back to work?" A long silence, then a clipped, "You're good." They drove off. Julian stood still for a long moment, the wind brushing his coat. They didn't arrest him. They didn't apologize either. He looked back up at the porch. The sign near the HOA entrance he passed earlier came back to him. "Welcome to Oak Ridge, preserving tradition since 1964. He stepped inside and closed the door, slow, steady, not with fear, but with purpose. The rest of the afternoon passed quietly. Julian's contractor, Darnell, showed up an hour later than expected, apologizing between bites of a sandwich. They walked the property together, noting where to start the plumbing, where the electrical panel would need updates. Julian talked through his vision room by room. This house wasn't just a flip. It was an anchor, a seed in soil that had been off limits for far too long. Darnell, A stout man with a sharp eye paused in the foyer. "You all right?" he asked. Julian nodded. "Cops showed up earlier," Darnell's brow furrowed. "Seriously?" Neighbors called it in. "Thought I was breaking in." Darnell shook his head. "Figures." Julian didn't reply. He walked to the window and looked out. The woman with the mug was gone, but the camera in her window still blinked red, recording. "They think we're passing through," Julian said. "Like we don't belong unless someone's mowing the lawn for them." "You gonna file something?" Darnell asked. Julian considered it. "No, I'm gonna finish this house. Then I'm gonna buy another one." That night, Julian stayed in the house later than planned. He brought in a portable heater and unfolded a camp chair in what would eventually become the living room. No furniture, no distractions, just the hum of vision. He opened his laptop and reviewed the deed again, checked the zoning records, confirmed the tax status. Then he did what his grandfather taught him to do: walk the block. He pulled on his coat and walked the quiet street. Every house had something to say. A flag here, a truck with a bumper sticker there. Each porch light flicked on automatically as he passed, casting long shadows that stretched behind him like memories. At the corner, he stopped at the entrance sign again. "Preserving tradition since 1964. He looked at the date, 1964, the year the Civil Rights Act passed, and yet this place clung to a past it never admitted out loud. Julian pulled out his phone and took a picture of the sign. He wasn't afraid. He was awake, and awakening was its own kind of ownership. Bicey. The time he returned to the house, something in him had shifted. The anger from earlier wasn't gone, but it had found direction. They had called the police, but he held the keys. They had whispered and recorded, but he had signatures, deeds, a closing date, a loan approval, a plan that didn't ask for their welcome, only their attention. Julian sat back in the folding chair. He opened a spreadsheet with nearby homes listed in pre-foreclosure. Oakridge wasn't struggling, but even the perfect-looking lawns hid debt. He started making notes, because if they were going to fear him for being here, then maybe it was time he gave them something real to fear, like the sound of his name echoing at every HOA meeting, like the line of ownership records slowly turning in his favor, like the fact that one day they'd open their mailboxes and realize the man they tried to run off now signed their mortgage notes. This wasn't just about property. This was about presence, about history, about saying, you can't gatekeep something built on exclusion and expect us not to knock. The second police call came 3 days later. Julian was inside, knee-deep in blueprints when the flashing lights returned. 2 patrol cars this time. Same posture, same assumptions. He had just unloaded a pallet of tiles into the garage. Dust clung to his sleeves. Sweat soaked the back of his neck. As the officers approached, he wiped his hands on his jeans and calmly stepped outside. Again. One officer gestured with his chin. "Sir, we received another report of suspicious activity. Are you the contractor?" Julian met the gaze without flinching. "I'm the owner." The younger officer stepped forward. "Do you have identification?" Julian sighed. "Just like last time," the older one glanced at his partner. "We need to verify it again." He retrieved his wallet, slowly, deliberately. As he handed them the deed papers and license, he noticed Gerald Green watching from his porch 2 doors down, arms crossed. Marcia standing beside him, sipping from a glass, her phone held casually but pointed in his direction. This time, there was no explanation, no question of who he was. They just wanted to remind him. After 20 minutes of scrutiny and sideways glances, the officers finally returned his documents. "You know," the younger one said, his tone oddly casual, "if you don't want people calling on you, maybe keep the doors shut when you're not inside." Julian stared at him. "I didn't know I needed permission to renovate my own house." The officer shrugged. "It's just advice. We're all trying to keep the peace around here." Julian didn't respond. He didn't need to. They left, and once again the neighborhood watched as if he were part of a show staged for their comfort. The next morning, he found a handwritten letter in his mailbox. No envelope. It read, "Some of us are concerned about the type of attention your project is drawing. Please be mindful that Oak Ridge is a quiet, family-oriented community. Discretion is appreciated. G. Green, HOA President. No signature." Just initials. Julian read the note 3 times before folding it neatly and placing it inside his folder labeled Documentation. That evening, his friend Raffi came by to help with demolition. As they tore up old carpet, Julian explained what had happened. Raffi leaned on a crowbar. "You surprised?" Julian shook his head. "Not surprised, just reminded." "Of what?" "That they never stopped seeing us as visitors, and they're always waiting to revoke the invitation." Raffi let out a low whistle. "You staying?" Julian looked around at the bare walls and exposed beams. "I'm not going anywhere." Saturday morning arrived with the sound of hammers and drills. Julian and Darnell had finally broken through the cracked kitchen tiles and were prepping for new cabinetry. The sun cut through the blinds, and for a while, Julian forgot where he was. He was simply building, making something better, something solid, until he stepped outside to grab the trash bins and saw the 2 police cruisers again. This time, they weren't parked at his house. They were idling across the street, waiting, watching. Gerald stood beside them, his arms folded, nodding to one of the officers like they were old golf buddies. Marcia stood on the curb with a camera, phone outstretched, narrating in a low voice. Another neighbor walked by with a dog, paused to glance at Julian, then hurried along. Julian walked calmly across his lawn and approached the officers. "Is there an issue?" Officer Danning, the older one, turned to him. "We received another complaint," Julian blinked. "From whom?" "I can't disclose that." Julian looked over at Gerald, whose smile didn't reach his eyes. Danning continued. "They said someone was possibly stripping copper wiring or stealing materials." "I'm the owner," Julian said, voice tight. "And I'm renovating. You've seen my documents. Do you have them with you again?" Julian nodded, jaw clenched, and walked to his truck to retrieve the folder. As he handed it over, a third car pulled up, a black SUV with tinted windows. A woman stepped out, camera already rolling. "Is this the property?" She asked no one. "In particular?" Gerald waved her closer. "Yep, this is it." Julian turned. "What is this?" Marcia grinned. "We've brought in someone from the local neighborhood watch blog. We just want to keep the area safe." The woman with the camera panned slowly across Julian's face, then over his house. Julian breathed deeply. "Am I under investigation?" he asked the officer. "No." "Am I suspected of a crime?" "No." "Then I'd like you and your audience," he gestured toward the camera, "to leave my property." There was a long pause. Danning looked like he wanted to argue, but said nothing. He turned, handed back the paperwork, and walked away. Julian stood there, hands trembling, heart pounding, but his spine unmoved. That night, he sat alone in the kitchen. The room smelled like plaster dust and sweat. He barely moved. He played the scene in his head over and over, the glances, the tone, the subtle accusation that always sat in their voices like a trap waiting to snap. In the stillness, a thought whispered through his mind like a vow. They didn't want him here. That was fine. They'd just have to learn to live with his name on their deeds. The following week brought silence, but not peace. Contractors started canceling. Darnell called twice to apologize. "Some of the guys said they don't feel comfortable in that neighborhood," he said carefully. "They've been getting calls from other clients too. Word's getting around." Julian understood the subtext. No one wanted to cross the invisible line Gerald Green had drawn around Oak Ridge. And even if they didn't say it out loud, they feared what it meant to be seen working beside him. Julian sat at the dining room window, watching the sun stretch shadows across the lawn. He hadn't told anyone yet, but his bank had sent an alert. His refinance offer had been flagged for property location reassessment. He opened his laptop, logged into the county assessor's website, and began pulling records, deeds, ownership, history, mortgage defaults, HOA filings. Then he found it, an old scanned document from 1973. The Oak Ridge Property Covenant, typed in neat courier font, redlining in legal language. No lot shall be sold or leased to any person not of the Caucasian race. He stared at it for a long time, a quiet, ugly relic buried under years of landscaping and updated bylaws. But it was still there, unenforceable now, but never removed. Julian leaned back, the creak of the chair loud in the still room. He thought of his grandfather, who used to say, "They'll sell you anything, except a seat at the table." He clicked through more documents. Gerald's name appeared multiple times. HOA president, former real estate agent, trustee, and then Julian saw it, an HOA tax report filed incorrectly. 3 years of delinquent maintenance fees on a shared parcel, a legal weak spot. He copied it, saved it, printed 3 versions. He didn't smile. He just exhaled. It wasn't just about this house anymore. It was about the next one, and the next. About cracking the system from the inside, using the very laws they'd once used to keep people like him out. They wanted quiet? He'd give them quiet. Quiet leverage, quiet documentation, quiet acquisitions. Julian stood, looked around the shell of the house, and nodded to himself. He wasn't going to fight them with fists or fire. He'd fight with contracts, LLCs, tax codes, and ownership transfers. He'd speak the language they respected: deeds, zoning, equity. He didn't need to knock on doors that were never made for him. He'd build his own entrance. Julian had always been good at silence. Not the kind that shrinks you, but the kind that holds weight. It was a survival skill, passed down through blood. His grandfather taught him that silence wasn't surrender. It was observation, strategy. Strength measured not by noise, but by patience. But lately, silence felt different. It felt like drowning. He no longer walked the neighborhood in the evenings. The stares had sharpened. The nods had stopped. A few cars slowed as they passed his driveway, long enough to remind him he was still being watched. Contractors dropped like dominoes. One called to say he couldn't make it anymore because of too many eyes. Another just ghosted him completely. Even Darnell, loyal and real, had gone quieter on texts. He always responded, just not right. Away, Julian's car was keyed one night. A long, jagged scar down the driver's side. No note, no witnesses. Just an empty hush that said, "You're not welcome here." He filed a police report knowing it wouldn't go anywhere. He didn't flinch when Officer Danning showed up to take the statement. Instead, he made a copy of the report and filed it in his folder labeled retaliation. Still, the wear was starting to show. He woke up tired, ate less, talked less. The house stayed half-finished, drywall exposed, fixtures sitting in boxes. It was like his motivation had been stolen one breath at a time. One night, while scrolling through real estate emails, Julian paused on a listing, an investment opportunity in a different part of town, safer, familiar, tempting. His finger hovered over the phone icon, but he didn't press it. Instead, he shut the laptop and leaned back in the worn chair. The hum of the ceiling fan filled the room. His eyes drifted to the stack of papers on the corner of the desk. Purchase agreements, zoning maps, bank approvals, all the proof that he had earned the space he occupied. So why did he still feel like he was trespassing? The memories came uninvited. His grandfather denied a home loan 3 times in 1 year. Too risky, they said, even with a stable job and perfect credit. His mother, a paralegal, fired for attitude after correcting a partner's misquoted statute in front of a client. His own childhood sitting in the back seat while his mother wiped tears before going into her second job, always telling him, "Don't let them make you small." But the pressure was real. Even his colleagues, people he thought he'd earned respect from, had started questioning his decision. You could have flipped a dozen houses in safer areas. Why Oak Ridge? Isn't that the place with all the gate drama? Don't let pride get in the way, man. Be smart. Their words stung more than the neighbors' stares, because they came from people who should have known better. Julian stopped responding to their messages. He needed space to think, to breathe, or maybe to break. He wasn't sure anymore. It was 3:17 a.m. when Julian sat up in bed, heart racing. Not from a dream, from a realization. He couldn't sleep, couldn't shake the idea clawing at the edges of his mind. Something was off, not just in how the neighbors treated him, but in how this entire place operated. He got out of bed, padded quietly to the desk, and powered up his laptop. Public records were his nighttime habit now. They comforted him more than music or books. He liked facts, numbers, the logic of paper trails. He pulled up the HOA's charter again, this time digging deeper into attachments and filing history, minutes from board meetings, archived tax filings. He blinked at one line, then zoomed in. Parcel 12B, Common Area Maintenance, 3 years unpaid property tax. The HOA had missed payments on shared land. That alone was an error, but what caught Julian's eye was the stamp. Lien warning issued. If left unresolved, the county could seize the parcel, or worse, list it at auction. A tiny crack in their perfect fence line. He opened another file. The bylaws of the Oak Ridge HOA. Long, tedious, but there it was. A clause that stated any member owning more than 25% of properties or land could petition to replace the board. Julian leaned back, the fog in his chest lifted. It wasn't just possible to challenge their structure. It was legal. He cross-referenced ownership data next. Names, lot numbers, liens. Several owners were late on dues. A few were retired. One had passed away and the estate hadn't been settled. That was the seed: foreclosure, delinquency, disinterest. And Julian had cash, leverage, patience. They wanted to keep him out, but they weren't paying attention to their own walls. Later that morning, coffee in hand, he drove to the county clerk's office, requested copies, printed everything, spent hours reading through line after line. By noon, he had a short list of 5 properties with vulnerabilities. He wasn't going anywhere. He was getting in. That evening, he walked the perimeter of Oak Ridge again, slowly, watching the houses, the subtle signs of neglect, peeling paint, unkempt lawns, a for sale sign tilted in a yard. Neighbors saw him and looked away. Julian smiled softly. They could ignore his presence. They couldn't ignore his paperwork. At home, he called the first number on his list, an out-of-town owner with an empty rental home in Oak Ridge. "Would you be open to selling?" he asked, voice calm. "Maybe," came the reply. "Make me an offer." He did, and the next day it was accepted. Julian closed the deal through a shell company, quietly, professionally. No one noticed when the name on the deed changed. He didn't tell anyone, not yet. But that night he allowed himself one small statement of victory. He went to his kitchen chalkboard, cleared the day's list and wrote 6 words. Buy them out, one by one. Days bled into nights and Julian's phone became his weapon of choice. He made calls quietly, attended estate auctions without drawing attention. Every step was methodical. Every document filed with intention. And still the tension persisted. At the coffee shop downtown, an acquaintance from his alumni group asked if he was still in that Oak Ridge mess. At the hardware store, a cashier made a joke about him, trying to gentrify the suburbs now. Each comment, casually wrapped in humor, cut just a little deeper than the last. Julian began taking longer drives through the city just to clear his mind. Sometimes he passed the neighborhoods he grew up in, once redlined, now rebranded as up-and-coming. Developers just like him were changing those streets. But none of them had to fight this kind of war just to park in their own driveway. One Sunday, he drove out to the cemetery where his grandfather was buried. The man had passed 2 years earlier. But in Julian's mind, his voice was still fresh. Still firm, still full of grit. He stood over the grave for a long time, then knelt, running his hand over the headstone. "I didn't come here to fight," he whispered. "I came to build." The wind rustled the nearby trees, but maybe the fight finds us anyway. Back at home, a thick manila envelope waited on his doorstep. No return address. Inside, a stack of HOA violation notices, fines for weeds in the yard, for a dumpster parked in the driveway, for tools visible through a garage window. Julian laughed. He laughed harder than he had in weeks, because this time, it wasn't fear he felt, it was confirmation. They were getting desperate. So he made another call, not to a contractor, but to an attorney, a woman named Karina Moss, known for handling quiet power moves. Her firm specialized in HOA litigation, zoning law, and, most importantly, real estate takeovers. Julian met her. The next morning, he handed her everything. The deed, the covenants, the tax default notices, the architectural review policies that had never been updated, the selective enforcement letters, the parcel list, everything. Karina read silently, then smiled. "This isn't going to be fast," she said. "But it's going to be surgical," Julian nodded. "That's all I need." By the end of the week, the first letters were drafted. Legal notices, property interest claims, quiet title actions, HOA compliance challenge forms. Julian mailed them, certified and stamped. He didn't need to knock on any doors. He owned the blueprint now, and it started with a single truth. They wanted him out. He was about to own them out, one foreclosure at a time. Julian made the next 3 purchases without saying a word. He'd learned the power of silence, of cloaking action in stillness. LLCs were easy to register, even easier to mask behind P.O. boxes and bland corporate names. One by one, he acquired properties that had sat vacant, neglected, or in legal limbo. He didn't knock on any doors. He didn't wave at any neighbors. He simply moved pieces on the board, quiet, firm, and precise. Parcel 6C, foreclosed. Unit 9A, probate dispute, settled. Lot 11, unpaid dues for 16 months, acquired via lien transfer. By spring, he held titles to 4 homes in Oak Ridge, the neighborhood. Didn't know it yet, but the soil had shifted beneath their feet. Still, Julian knew that legal landmines waited. The HOA had its claws buried deep in the subdivision's fabric. He needed someone sharp, someone who understood the ugly subtleties of exclusion that weren't written in laws, but lived in zoning codes, bylaws, and committee votes. Enter Tessa. And she was a civil rights attorney who had made a name fighting housing discrimination cases across the Southeast. Julian had followed her work for years. When he reached out, she responded within a day. They met in her small office across town, where case files lined the walls and the smell of strong coffee lingered in the air. Tessa reviewed his documents silently, flipping through each file with clinical speed. "HOA's sloppy," she said. "Finally. Charter hasn't been updated in 12 years, violates multiple fair housing clauses. They selectively enforce their rules, which is already ammunition." Julian leaned forward. "So what's the move?" She smiled. "We get you onto the board, quietly. Then you rewrite the rules." Julian blinked. "They'll never let me in. They won't know until you're already seated. The bylaws allow any property owner in good standing to run for a vacant seat. And guess what?" She tapped the deed stack. "You're now the largest private owner in Oak Ridge." It was the first time Julian had felt lightness in weeks. He didn't laugh, but he did breathe. Over the next month, he and Tessa worked meticulously. They filed every required document, challenged every violation, appealed every fine. And where they found weak spots, they pressed, submitting legal rebuttals, formal petitions, and city complaints. It wasn't warfare. It was reform with teeth. By early summer, Gerald Green had caught on. Julian was standing outside one of the new properties, installing solar panels, when Gerald pulled up, engine still running. "You buying up everything now?" Gerald asked, voice thick with contempt. Julian didn't respond. Gerald stepped closer. "You think you're clever. But this neighborhood has standards. We built something here." Julian kept working, unbothered. Gerald leaned in. "Oak Ridge isn't for everyone." Julian turned, calm, centered. "No, it's for owners. And that's exactly what I am." Gerald's mouth twitched. He got back in his car and sped off. The Next week, Marcia launched a Facebook group titled Save Oakridge. Posts flooded in about community integrity and preserving values. Though no names were mentioned, every photo featured Julian's homes in some way. A construction site here, a non-white contractor there. Then came the cease and desist, a thick envelope from the HOA's law firm, accusing Julian of unauthorized development, citing obscure clauses about aesthetic compliance and community preservation. Julian handed it to Tessa without blinking. She smiled. They just stepped on a rake. Tessa fired back the next morning with a blistering 12-page response. She cited state housing law, federal discrimination statutes, and dozens of previous HOA cases. Attached were photos of similar renovations by white homeowners that had never received so much as a warning. The letter ended with a quiet threat. Pursue this further and we'll see you in court, with press. The cease and desist vanished. No apology, no acknowledgement. Just silence. But the silence told its own story. Julian kept working. Each renovation was like a small rebellion, a reclaimed bathroom, a widened porch, solar panels that glinted like defiance in the sun. And then came his most deliberate act yet. Finished renovations on Parcel 9A, an aging two-story with peeling white paint and a rotted fence. He transformed it into a home with bright shutters, a garden of wildflowers, and a porch swing. He listed it at below-market rent. The applications came fast, dozens, but one stood out. Alicia Thomas, 33, single mom, nurse, and her 7-year-old son, Micah. When she toured the house, Julian watched her eyes widen. He watched Micah race into the backyard and spin in circles, arms wide like wings. He handed her the keys that same day. Neighbors noticed immediately. A young black woman moving in. No moving truck. No realtor. Just presence. Gerald's next newsletter arrived with coded warnings about outside leasing practices and families who may not share our values. Julian smiled as he recycled it. Later that week, Alicia knocked on his door. She brought cookies, still warm. I just wanted to say thank you, she said. Julian nodded. It's yours now. Make it home. She hesitated. People are staring. Some have said things, not directly, but Julian met her gaze. You're not alone here. And you're not a guest. She held his eyes for a long second, then nodded. They stood on the porch together, a quiet line in the sand. As summer deepened, tension spread like heat. Some neighbors avoided eye contact altogether. Others doubled down, organizing neighborhood watch patrols and anonymous flyers warning about demographic shifts. But Julian didn't bend. He made his 4th purchase in late July. This one was special. It sat right across from the greens. Gerald came outside as Julian measured the front lawn. Are you trying to start something? Gerald snapped. Julian didn't flinch. No, I'm building something. Gerald laughed bitterly. You're tearing this place apart. Julian finally looked him in the eye. It was never whole to begin with. Julian's next step wasn't made of concrete or contracts. It was made of votes. The HOA's annual meeting was scheduled for early September. Tessa, ever strategic, reminded him of the clause buried in the charter. Any property owner in good standing could run for a board seat, and Julian, owning now nearly 20% of the neighborhood's parcels, directly or through affiliates, was undeniably qualified. The board didn't see it coming. He filed his candidacy under one of the LLCs. There were whispers, of course. Marcia posted vague rants on her Facebook group. Someone who doesn't value Oakridge heritage is trying to take over from the inside. She wrote. The post was shared dozens of times, commented on with cryptic lines like, "We know who you mean," and "What happened to neighborhood pride?" Julian said nothing. He showed up to the meeting wearing a navy blazer and clean lines. Tessa stood at his side, silent but formidable. When his name was announced, half the room blinked in confusion, the other half tensed. But it was legal, valid, irrefutable. Julian stood, gave a short speech, calm, composed, firm. "I'm not here to erase Oakridge," he said. "I'm here to make it honest. Equal, accountable. I'm here to make sure that what's written matches what's practiced. Silence. Then slow, hesitant applause from the back, and a few votes from the center. It wasn't enough to win that night, but it was enough to shake them, enough to fracture their assumed control. The next day, Alicia sent Julian a message. Micah had made the honor roll. She wrote, "He says he wants to be an architect, like the guy who gave him a backyard." Julian read it 3 times, then drove to Parcel 6C. He walked through the empty rooms, imagining a family's laughter echoing off the walls. He wasn't done yet, but he was no longer alone. They had money. He had memory, and memory knew how to hold a grudge. The letter arrived in a thick white envelope embossed with the Oak Ridge HOA seal. Inside, clipped to a condescending cover sheet, was a notice. Emergency board hearing regarding voting rights. Reassessment. Julian read it once, then again. They were trying to strip him of his vote. It wasn't surprising, but it was sloppy. The date was set for Tuesday, 2 days away. Julian didn't panic. He printed copies of every deed he held, pulled the charter again, highlighted the percentage clause in red ink. Then he called Tessa. "They're going to try and outvote you," she said. "They can't," he replied. "I own too much." "Then this isn't about legality," she warned. "It's about intimidation." Julian didn't flinch. "Let's give them a meeting they'll never forget." The room was packed, folding chairs in stiff rows, HOA board members seated like royalty behind a plastic table. Gerald was front and center, papers stacked high beside him. Marcia perched on the edge of her seat, jaw tight. Julian entered alone, until Tessa walked in behind him. No smile, no theatrics, just presence. Gerald opened the meeting. "There's been growing concern," he began, "that certain acquisitions of property have created a conflict of interest with the charter's intent." Julian stood silently. "This board believes," Gerald continued, "that it may be necessary to vote on a temporary freeze of any new rights of representation until further review." "Point of order," Tessa interrupted smoothly. "Before this board continues, my client would like to submit documentation." She handed copies to each member, signed deeds, tax receipts, legal ownership of 6 properties. According to your own bylaws, any resident owning more than 30% of independent lots has full voting privileges and rights to petition for board adjustments. Silence. Julian stepped forward. "I didn't come here to argue," he said. "I came with facts. You want to remove my voice, but my presence is already written into the land." Gerald scoffed. "You think you're clever?" "No," Julian replied. "I think I'm consistent." Then he opened a folder. From it, he pulled a sheet of names. "I'd like to read something." Tessa nodded beside him, calm and unwavering. Julian's voice didn't rise. He read each name carefully like it mattered. Because it did. Henry Talbot, denied 1961, no reason given. Lenora Wallace, application lost. 1963, Samuel and Myra Jefferson, loan revoked day of closing. 1971, dozens of names, black families turned away, erased. And now, he continued, lifting another paper, the addresses I currently own. He listed them, one after another, each one a rebuttal, each one a correction. "I didn't buy houses," he said softly. "I bought silence, and I'm giving it back a voice." The room stayed quiet, not the kind of silence that came from agreement, but the kind that followed impact. Weighty, uneasy. Gerald shifted in his seat. "We don't need a history lesson," he muttered. "But the land does," Julian replied, holding his gaze. "Because history shaped who could stand on it." Marcia leaned forward. "Are you accusing this board of racism?" Tessa interjected before Julian could answer. "We're stating facts. We have documentation showing a decades-long pattern of discriminatory practices, selective enforcement, unjust code violations, and now a deliberate attempt to strip a legal property owner of voting power. If this continues, we're prepared to escalate." A ripple moved through the audience. People whispered. Some nodded. Julian's presence had started as a threat. Now it was a statement. "I'm not here to make Oak Ridge mine," he said. "I'm here to make sure Oak Ridge doesn't belong only to people who look like you." Gerald stood suddenly. "I won't be lectured in my own community." Tessa didn't move. "Then perhaps you shouldn't have built it on exclusion." Julian kept his voice steady. "I know every nail in my properties. I know every square foot of drywall, every beam in the foundation. Because I didn't just buy these houses, I rebuilt them. While your board sent notices, I sent contractors. While you campaigned, I paid taxes you forgot." He reached into his folder again, pulled out one more page. "This is a financial audit of your HOA expenditures over the past 3 years. You redirected community funds to legal fees to fight one homeowner, me. You misused reserve accounts, and you allowed personal bias to inform community decisions." Gasps now. Few board members looked down. "I'm not asking for a vote," Julian said. "I'm demanding one." He paused, then added, "Right now." Gerald opened his mouth, but another board member, a gray-haired woman named Beth, who had sat mostly silent until now, spoke first. "I second the motion." Everyone turned. She folded her hands. "It's time." Votes were cast, and when they were counted, the motion to strip Julian's rights failed. Another motion passed in its place, for Gerald's resignation. Gerald refused at first, until Tessa slid a sealed envelope across the table. A formal complaint. "Backed by state housing authorities. You can leave on your own," she said, calm as ever, "or be removed by law." His chair scraped loudly as he stood and walked out. No goodbye, no apology, just loss. By the time Julian returned home that evening, his phone had already started buzzing. First it was a reporter from the local paper, then a podcast producer, then a national housing rights nonprofit. Somehow word had gotten out. Tessa later confirmed it wasn't them. Probably one of the silent voters, or someone in the room who realized history had shifted in real time. The headline appeared on Twitter that night. "Black developer flips racist neighborhood, literally." Underneath, a photo of Julian standing on the porch of Parcel 6C, arms folded, a subtle smile playing at the edge of his mouth. By morning, the story was on national news. Interviews requests flooded Tessa's inbox. Donations poured in to support housing equity causes. Julian stayed quiet. He declined most interviews. He wasn't interested in fame. He was interested in something else: ownership. Gerald's house, Lot 5B, went into foreclosure a month later. The irony was brutal. After years of championing property values and HOA tradition, Gerald had failed to keep up with his mortgage. Rumor had it the legal fees drained him. Others said his pride did. Julian bought the property in cash. It wasn't about revenge. It was about closing a loop. When the sale finalized, he stood in the empty foyer of Gerald's former home. The walls were still painted beige. A bookshelf remained half-filled. There were dents in the floorboards, shallow but permanent. He walked through each room slowly. He didn't feel victory. He felt weight. So he made a decision. He wouldn't live there. He'd build something instead. 6 months later, a bright blue sign hung above the door. Oak Ridge Mentorship Center, a home for opportunity inside. Rows of desks filled the old living room. Bookshelves lined the walls. A small reading nook occupied what used to be a sunroom. A mural stretched across the back wall, painted by Micah and other neighborhood kids, showing hands of all colors building a house together. Julian stood by. The door on opening day, Alicia was there, so was Tessa, and Beth, the quiet board member who had seconded the vote. People came, not just black families, but Latino, Asian, white. People who understood that progress doesn't shout, it works, quietly, intentionally, one deed at a time. Months passed. The headlines faded, but the roots Julian planted only grew stronger. The Mentorship Center became a fixture. Teens who once passed Oak Ridge on their way to less welcoming streets now walked in proudly. Some came for help with homework. Others came just to feel safe. Julian kept a low profile. He didn't plaster his name across the building. But people knew, and more importantly, they remembered. The new HOA board rewrote the charter. Gone were the selective aesthetic clauses. Gone were the unwritten tradition codes. In their place, transparency policies, inclusive practices, and a rotating community advisory board. Beth became president. Julian never ran. He didn't need to. His impact was already cemented. Literally, Parcel 9A, Alicia's house, now hosted monthly family dinners for new residents. Micah had built a miniature library box that sat on the corner. He named it Books for Builders. One morning, Julian stood outside the center as the sun broke through clouds. He watched a line of cars slow as they passed. A few waved. One man stopped to take a picture of the mural. It hit him then. Not with drama, but with quiet finality. They had called the cops to push him out. Now they drove past signs with his name on them. Tessa once asked him if it had all been worth it. The fear. The humiliation, the fight. He hadn't answered then, but now, standing in front of a home once built to exclude, and now filled with laughter and light, he knew. It was more than worth it. It was necessary. Not for revenge, for repair. Because sometimes the best way to win isn't to shout. It's to sign the deed and let the foundation speak for itself. The neighborhood no longer looked the same. The hedges were trimmed, but now they framed porches with bikes leaning against them, wind chimes dancing in the breeze, and children's chalk drawings on the sidewalks. The mailbox flags weren't all the same style anymore. The paint on each home varied in color and spirit. It wasn't just Oak Ridge. It was owned, claimed, and lived in. Diverse families shared recipes over fences. Lawn chairs circled under summer skies. A community potluck happened every first Saturday, hosted alternately by people who, just years ago, had never spoken to one another. Julian rarely walked through the neighborhood without a pause. Someone always called out a hello. Someone always waved. Micah, now a teenager, always ran up for a fist bump. His mother had since saved enough to buy the home she'd once rented. Julian sold it to her under market value. No paperwork beyond what was necessary. He didn't boast about it. He didn't need to. His work had spoken louder than any headline. These days, Julian spent more time speaking at forums and workshops than buying homes. He never branded himself as a guru. But when he spoke, people leaned in. At a real estate equity summit in Atlanta, he took the stage quietly. A navy blazer, no slides, no preamble. He titled his talk, "The Power of Deeds and the Deeds Behind the Power." He told them about Oak Ridge, not just the properties, but the people, the pain, the paperwork, the policies. He told them about the day he was made to sit on a curb in front of a house he legally owned. He told them how he stayed, fought, built, and gave back. In the front row, a young boy sat beside his mother, eyes wide, legs bouncing. After the session, while Julian gathered his notes, the boy approached. He looked about 11. "Excuse me, sir," the boy asked. "How did you do it?" Julian smiled, lowering to the boy's eye level. "I didn't buy their homes to prove them wrong," he said softly. "I did it to show us what's possible." The boy nodded slowly. Then Julian added, "Because ownership isn't just about, and it's about legacy." The boy's mother thanked Julian and smiled, her eyes glassy with quiet pride. She didn't have to say the words. Julian had heard them in so many forms before. "You made space where there was none. You proved something for all of us." Julian walked out of the convention hall, the hum of applause still echoing behind him. Outside, the Atlanta heat wrapped around him like a familiar weight, but it didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt earned. Back in Oak Ridge, the mentorship center had grown. It now housed a small tech lab stocked with donated laptops. Teens gathered in the evenings for coding lessons, financial literacy sessions, and Saturday vision board workshops. Julian never forced himself into the spotlight. He simply showed up, sometimes with pizza, sometimes with spreadsheets, always with purpose. He'd started teaching a quarterly course called Roots and Roofs, Building Black Wealth Through Property. The name came from his grandfather, who used to say, "A man with roots and a roof can weather any storm." Julian had weathered his. And now he was teaching others how to build their own. On the anniversary of his first home purchase in Oak Ridge, Julian stood in the doorway of the very house he was once nearly arrested outside of. He looked across the street at Gerald's old home, now painted in calming ocean blue. The sign for the mentorship center bold and clear. Kids were filing in for an afternoon session. Micah, now nearly Julian's height, held the door open for a group of younger boys. They laughed as they passed him, easy and unafraid. Julian closed his eyes for a moment and let it wash over him. The fear, the fight, the foundation, and now, the future. That night he opened a new journal and wrote just one sentence on the first page. They tried to erase my presence, so I wrote it into the land. He closed the book and smiled, not because it was over, but because now it would never be forgotten.